As warnings go, it's hard to imagine one starker than that issued by the Norwegian Refugee Council on September the 3rd. Quoting here, "We cannot be clearer. Sudan is experiencing a starvation crisis of historic proportions. Every opportunity to head off the worst of this situation has been missed, and now the people of Sudan face a crisis unmatched in decades." The crisis in question is a famine, one that threatens to be so large, so widespread that researchers are cautioning it could become the deadliest seen in 40 years. In the worst sense of the word, that's an incredible claim. If true, it would mean that the suffering in Sudan may soon eclipse that seen in Yemen in 2018, Tigray in 2022, or even North Korea in the early 1990s. In terms of the body count alone, it could be the greatest hunger catastrophe experienced by any nation since the Ethiopian famine of the mid-1980s. And that's just at the midpoint for projections. The regions most academics agree is a reasonable scenario for the future. At the highest end, such as the pessimistic scenario published by a researcher at the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands, the death toll could become so great as to make Ethiopia's nightmare seem almost trifling. As The Economist grimly noted, quoting here, "If much more help does not arrive very soon, it may prove the worst famine anywhere in the world since millions starved to death during China's Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s and early 1960s. For those of us living comfortable lives in 2024, such a claim probably sounds unhinged, the result of a writer mainlining liquid hyperbole before filing their report. Surely, the starvation of tens of millions in a single event is something that we left behind in the 20th century, right? Well, who knows? Perhaps that is the case. We'll go a little deeper into these projections later in today's video, so you can decide for yourselves which are credible. For now, though, we'll simply point out that no matter how big it ultimately winds up being, there are definitive signs that a starvation crisis is already underway in Sudan. Back in August, for example, the United Nations announced that a refugee camp known as Zamzam had reached level 5 on the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification's hunger scale, only the third time in 20 years that anyone on Earth has hit that grim milestone. Level 5 is when a famine is officially declared, and signs are that conditions in the camp mean it is fully deserved. Médecins Sans Frontières has reported that a child dies there every 2 hours due to starvation or diseases brought on by a lack of food. But Zamzam is not unique. The UN believes there are many more parts of Sudan that are suffering just as badly. The only difference is that researchers have access to reliable data from the camp. With the fighting so bad elsewhere, the world is relying on anecdotes to try and understand the situation. And what awful anecdotes they are. There are the doctors from one of the last medical facilities in South Darfur who claim between 4 and 5 children in their care are dying of malnutrition every single day. Or there's the July assessment from the NGO Mercy Corps, which found that maybe a quarter of all children in central Darfur are suffering acute malnutrition. Then there are the nationwide estimates. The Norwegian Refugee Council thinks up to 25 million people may be going hungry, with the worst affected reduced to eating insects and leaves. Overall, the IPC suggests 750,000 people may already be in famine conditions, with another 8.5 million at emergency levels of hunger. Unusually for a modern starvation crisis, it is not just the hinterland that's suffering. While Darfur is the famine's epicenter, it's also gripping once wealthy urban areas. The capital of Khartoum, once one of Africa's most vibrant cities, has been reduced to rubble. Those who still shelter in its ruins are unable to access food or clean drinking water. In its twin city of Omdurman, people are already reported to have starved to death. Now, by this point, you might be wondering, how did this happen? How did any nation in the modern age manage to collapse so utterly that millions starve while its capital resembles a dark post-apocalyptic fantasy? Well, as always with these things, the full answer is complex, but the simplified version can be summed up in a single sentence. What happened to Sudan is war. The war in question is the ugly fight for power that erupted in April 2023 between the Sudanese army under General al-Burhan and a paramilitary outfit known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, under a warlord known as Hemeti. If you want the longer version, we've actually done 2 videos on the origins of the conflict that are available in our archive. For today's story, though, all you need to know is that what began as a power struggle between two generals quickly morphed into a wild free-for-all, which saw the RSF unleash a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Darfur, the Sudanese army start bombing civilian areas, and third parties such as the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North seize huge chunks of territory for themselves. The carnage that resulted has been jaw-dropping, even for a world already used to images of destruction broadcast from Ukraine and Gaza. Entire cities, such as Khartoum, have been obliterated. A fifth of the country's population of 48 million has been turned into refugees. No one knows how many have died, but the US envoy to Sudan estimates that it could be as many as 150,000. This is the context needed to understand the looming famine, a context in which some 80% of hospitals in combat areas have been destroyed, one in which diseases like cholera are starting to spread. However, to really comprehend why things are so bad, we need to not look at the conflict's impact on urban areas, but on the long-struggling agricultural sector. The keywords there are long-struggling. Even before the conflict ignited, Sudan's situation was precarious. Here's how the conversation described things. Issues included economic instability, high inflation, and frequent climate shocks such as droughts and floods. Agricultural production was often below average. Many regions depended on food imports, which were easily disrupted by logistical challenges. For such a precarious system, the conflict was the ultimate disruption. The NGO-produced report, Beyond the Numbers, Hunger and Conflict in Sudan, documents how the warring parties swept into agricultural areas. To quote it, "Attacks, looting, and destruction have caused whole villages to flee, forcing farmers to abandon their land. This has fueled hunger not only for their families, but also for the communities that relied on the food they produced." Now, much of this has been carried out by the RSF, which Sudan expert Alex Duval has described as a looting machine. Regions here have included former breadbasket states like Al Jazeera, which the UN has now declared at risk of famine. In their piece, The Conversation estimated that 40% of the nation's farmers hadn't been able to till their land this year due to the ongoing insecurity. Those who have managed to farm have sometimes found that there's nowhere safe to sell their crops. Working markets have been repeatedly bombarded, while trucks carrying supplies on key logistic routes have been attacked and looted as well. As food has become scarcer, the price of what is available has correspondingly shot up. The prices of staple goods are now estimated to be 350% above their pre-war average. To give you some idea of just how sharp a rise this is, cast your mind back to the summer of 2022, when inflation was at its peak in America. Remember how pissed off you felt seeing the prices skyrocket in the food aisles? Well, CPI data shows that food inflation in the US peaked at 13.5% that year. The inflation Sudan, already a much poorer country, is now suffering is orders of magnitude greater. To be clear, this is a result of deliberate choices made by the warring parties. While any conflict, would have badly shaken Sudan's ability to produce food, the way this particular war is being waged all but guarantees millions will go hungry. And nowhere is that truer than in areas where both sides have weaponized food distribution. In the RSF's case, that has involved cutting off supplies to areas their forces have placed under siege. Most dramatically, this includes the city of Al Fasher in North Darfur and the nearby Zamzam refugee camp, the very place where the UN declared the start of the famine. Today, the city and camp house maybe 2 million people who are now at risk of starvation. Combined with their looting and destruction of agricultural land in breadbasket states like Sana'a and Al Jazeera, it's clear that the RSF bear heavy responsibility for the hunger crisis. Yet, while Hemeti may be a ruthless warlord, there's a good argument to be made that where food politics are concerned, he's a mere amateur. As Alex Duval has written in the London Review of Books, up to 90% of those facing famine are living in RSF-controlled areas. And while some of that is down to the RSF's own looting, a lot of it is down to a deliberate military strategy that the army is pursuing. A strategy of starvation. Back in September 2023, the UN announced that it would recognize the army's leader, General al-Burhan, as the official representative of Sudan. From some angles, this move kind of made sense. Of the two commanders, the RSF's Hemeti is by far the more loathsome. As you watch this, his men are carrying out a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Darfur that UN experts are warning may constitute a genocide. When his forces overran the city of El Janina last year, they are estimated to have systematically slaughtered between 10 and 15,000 members of the Masalit tribe, a massacre worse even than the one that took place in Srebrenica during the Bosnian War. Yet while Hemeti may truly be one of the most evil men this channel has ever covered, right up there with guys like ex-Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, that does not mean that General al-Burhan is a saint. Oh, so far from it. Back in 2021, al-Burhan conspired with Hemeti to overthrow Sudan's civilian-led transitional government. Since the start of the war, his forces have reportedly bombed densely populated urban areas. And now he may be deliberately engineering a famine to starve his opponents. As the recognized head of state, al-Burhan has had to give his permission for the UN to deliver aid to any part of Sudan, including the parts that are not under his control. As Naval explains, quote, "The Sudanese army has no forces within 300 miles of the Sudan-Chad border. But as the acknowledged government of Sudan, it has the legal authority to close the frontier and obstruct humanitarian aid." Because of this legal technicality, the UN cannot dispatch aid trucks overland from Chad into Darfur. And we must stress here, it really is only a technicality. The army does not control this border, a fact that can be seen every time RSF gunrunners flip back and forth across it with impunity. But because the UN has to defer to Sudan's recognized head of state, its lawyers will not let aid trucks across. To be fair, the blockade is not total. Since August the 15th, al-Burhan has allowed some aid trucks in from Chad. However, they may only use a single crossing, and as The Economist reports, quoting here, the army continues to drag its feet with the necessary paperwork. Dewal believes that this is all part of a strategy to create the conditions for unrest or even outright rebellion in RSF-held areas. Quoting again, "For an army struggling to make progress on the battlefield, starvation is a cheap and effective weapon, and the army intends to use it to the full. The trouble is, whether it works or not, al-Burhan's strategy will lead to the deaths of huge numbers of civilians. As to exactly how many may die in the coming months, it's difficult to say, and predictions vary. Most researchers also don't like to give out exact figures since data from inside the war zone is so sparse, and modeling what might happen is therefore extremely hard. Those working at the IPC, for example, will only refer to hundreds of thousands who are likely to die. Others, though, are more willing to offer concrete figures. One senior UN official briefed in February that some 222,000 children might perish this year. In May, the Klingendahl Institute put together a model that suggested the overall death toll might be as high as 2.5 million. This model was somewhat controversial since it involved calculating the availability of food versus the basic nutritional needs of the population and using the shortfall to reach its figures. Dewal has called this method of calculation a last resort practice and noted that a similar model used in Darfur in the famine of 1984 overestimated the eventual death toll by more than a factor of 6. Still, Klingendahl's analysts believe they've calibrated well for factors like the pre-existing food shortages in neighboring countries. One of their number, Timo Gasbeek, has even gamed out potential scenarios all the way until 2027. The Economist reports that his optimistic scenario foresees about 6 million Sudanese dead by then. The pessimistic foresees a final famine-related death toll of over 10 million. The last time any single famine killed that many people, well, that was Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward. Now, to be clear, this is the pessimistic scenario of an already pessimistic model. Few other analysts are willing to predict an outcome quite so catastrophic. But even if the eventual death toll falls far short of 10 million, the one thing most experts agree on is that the coming famine in Sudan is going to be bad. Like, once in a generation bad. And sadly, it seems that there's very little that the world can do to avert it. Right now, neither the army nor the RSF are willing to make peace. 16 ceasefires have already been agreed upon and then ignored since the conflict erupted. At the most recent talks in Switzerland, General al-Burhan didn't even bother sending a representative. Meanwhile, the RSF continues to try and expand its territory into agricultural states like Sana'a and White Nile, its troops burning and looting as they go. As they do so, they destroy any hopes that the next harvest might bring some relief to Sudan's starving people. Nor can any hope be found on the international stage. Although both the army and RSF are kept afloat by outside backers, Egypt and Iran for the army, UAE for the RSF, none of their sponsors has shown any inclination to ask them to ease off. In short, the tragedy about to engulf Sudan may be one that's unavoidable. A tragedy born of two men desperately struggling for power, seemingly indifferent to the mass suffering that struggle has brought. It is a grim way to end a video, but then there's nothing remotely upbeat or hopeful about what is now happening in these places. Places like Darfur, Khartoum, and Kordofan. Only the spectre of yet another of the four horsemen joining what is already an apocalyptic fight. Sudan today may be the world's great forgotten crisis, overshadowed by both Ukraine and Gaza. Sadly, though, it could soon become infamous as the site of the greatest catastrophe that we have seen in decades.